This movement seeks to empower people to stand up for our sacred values, our citizen rights, and constitutional freedoms that were inked on that piece of paper by our forefathers.
Shining a light on the darkness of today's challenges. This is the Lantern Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Lantern Podcast. I am your host, Garrett Soldano, and I'm here with my special co-host today, Ron Armstrong.
Glad to be here.
Extremely excited to welcome our next guest, who is running for Kalamazoo County Sheriff, Shannon Bagley. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today.
So go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I tell you what, I'm a lifelong Kalamazoo County resident, born and raised. Grew up in Portage, attended Portage Public Schools, graduated from Portage Northern High School.
So we won't talk about Portage Central right now.
Well, see, here's the problem. My son and daughter both graduated from Portage Central.
Oh, the house is divided.
Oh, it is a divided house, and it is quite the rivalry. But I still have to go with the dogs, so
That's
go Huskies. Right. But pleasure to be here again. I finished up after graduating high school. I attended Kalamazoo Valley Community College. I have an associate's degree in criminal justice from there. Later on, I attended Spring Arbor University. My son attended Siena Heights University, and I have a bachelor's degree in organization and resource management from there. In 1990, I began my law enforcement, experience/career while graduating from the Kalamazoo County Reserve Deputy Academy. For the next 2.5 years, I volunteered my time serving in that capacity and was hired at the Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety in late 1992, where I retired, came off the books in August of 2018 after a very, like I said, I had a blessed career. Just prior to my retirement, I was the captain of our Criminal Investigation Division, which is the Detective Bureau, and our Crime Lab. Like I said, I had just a very blessed career. I worked Operations Division Patrol. I worked undercover in our drug unit. I was a detective. I was a street sergeant, so I supervised daily operations of police and fire in Kalamazoo. KDPS is a PSO, so it's a police and fire discipline, right? Police, fire, and EMS. Was fortunate enough to serve in the frontline supervision capacity for a little over 11 years. I was then promoted to lieutenant and placed in the Office of Professional Standards as the inspector. So I did internal affairs, audits, policy review, those type of thing. For a number of years, I was then promoted to the rank of captain, where I oversaw the Office of Professional Standards for a number of years. And then, like I said, prior to my retirement, I went and served as the captain of the Detective Bureau and Crime Lab. So, in a nutshell, that's my experience.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, just a little bit. That's right. Yeah. It's great because you were able to experience all levels of law enforcement throughout all of those years. And it's a different world from officer to lieutenant to captain to running for sheriff. So tell me where that process came to be and how and why.
Wow. Well, I tell you, this is something that initially when I retired, I wasn't going to take this monumental task on. But after a lot of prayer and contemplation and discussing things with my wife, it's time we noticed, and I felt very strongly from various years of experience locally there within Kalamazoo County that there needs to be change. I love the Kalamazoo County community. It's a fantastic place to raise your family. And I just believe very strongly that leadership within the sheriff's office there in Kalamazoo, the residents of Kalamazoo County need to have a leader that's focused on problem solving, that partnering and building relationships with our community so that we can stand shoulder to shoulder and work together to solve the issues that are in our neighborhoods and not be focused and not be so driven politically. I think we're missing the mark, and that's a large part why I made the decision to run. It's time for a change, and it's time for leadership to be more inclusive.
Do you have a primary challenger then?
Yeah, I have a primary. Okay. August 4th we'll have a primary, and like I said, I think we're going to be just fine. I don't know my primary opponent very well. I think he's probably a nice guy. But if you're going to compare education, resume, experience, I don't think it's I don't think it's close. So we're, like I said, I think we're confident that the voters here in Kalamazoo County, especially the Republican primary voters, are going to do their homework. They're going to do their due diligence, learn about both candidates, and we're confident that we'll come out on the plus side when that occurs. So.
Is your the current sheriff, is he rerunning, or how many terms has he served?
He's been, well, he'll have 12 years in, so he's in his 12th year.
Okay.
And yep, he's running again. So
Unopposed, or does he?
Yes, he does not have a
Okay.
primary, and he's running unopposed.
All right. And with your experience there, you've had a relationship with him at some capacity or level, you know.
Yeah.
And I would guess that that's been a respectful situation. So where do you stand with him, or tell us a little bit about the differences of
Certainly.
what you see?
I've known our current sheriff, Rick Fuller, for probably, I'd say, between 18 and 20 years. Sheriff Fuller was a sergeant. I believe he was a jail sergeant when he was elected in 2008. The differences between him and I think leadership is the biggest component there. And I think leadership about doing the next right thing. I think being fiscally responsible and building relationships within the community are where you're going to see a differentiation between his approach and my approach. I think that a sheriff needs to be available not just every 3 or 3.5 years when the elections come around. I think the emphasis on being intentional on relationships is ongoing. The foundation of a law enforcement agency is found in its relationships with the community. That is on which you are going to build everything else within your organization, is that relationship. And the relationship component is probably the most, well, it is the most important, because you need to build trust. And without the relationship, you can't build trust, and therefore you can't create that atmosphere of legitimacy. Without those things, you don't have the backing of the community. You don't have the engagement. You don't have the ability to get your message out there, to work within the community, to get ahead of certain problems, to get ahead of certain issues, is what we're seeing now playing out nationally. Even with good relationships, even there's areas in which we've even seen here in Michigan, in Genesee County, for instance, that sheriff there has a fantastic relationship, and we didn't see some of the destruction or the rioting, if you will, in those locations. So relationship is the single most important thing that you can have with your community from a law enforcement perspective.
Yeah, because it's a lot different now for law enforcement than it was, 10 to 15, 20 years.
Right.
I just saw a meeting this morning, obviously Stand Up Michigan, we support our men and women who wear the badge, and we do not condone any violence. We do not condone any violence against our men and women that wear the badge. And you almost feel sorry for what they're going up against right now.
It's, it's almost cliche, but I'll say it. We're living in unprecedented times. You have a couple different competing scenarios, right? Situations that we've on the national level that we're discussing. You're having the Minneapolis situation with George Floyd, and then this most recent in I believe it was Atlanta. Yeah, and forgive me that the name of the individual is escaping me at this time. But well, people are trying to draw comparisons, and it's okay to on a very cursory, very I say initial examination of the situations, you can say that there's some comparables there. But the reality is, there's these. We're not dealing with apples, or even apples to oranges here. These are very different, and I think we need, from a law enforcement perspective, and how hot it is right now from a community standpoint, and it's understandable, right? There's things that we have to have. We have to go out and we have to have uncomfortable conversations about some things that we just, quite frankly, maybe haven't completely dealt with within society. That's fine. That's what the direction that we need to move, and leaders are going to step up and have those conversations, and not sit back in the wings and be afraid to come forth and take the heat. Leadership is all about how do we meet this head on, and how do we work with the community, and how do we move forward? How do we heal? How do we build? How do we expand training? Whatever it is that we're going to do, let's have a conversation about it. Let's tone down the rhetoric. Let's dial back the barometer, and let's come together, because at the end of the day, it's all about how do we move the community forward? How do we get good women and men involved in law enforcement? I ran recruiting and hiring for a while at our organization. The barometer is such right now, law enforcement organizations have had a difficult time recruiting and hiring, getting good people to come in to do this job. Who in their right mind is looking at law enforcement and going, well, this is a viable career option for me right now? Who would want to do that?
Yeah.
And that to me is a very scary a scary position to be in. We need solid women and men to come in to do a very difficult job. And I was reading an article, and the author escapes me right now, but in essence it said this: look, we want to recruit. So recruiting is paramount, right? Recruiting and then background checks. So if we recruit well and we do a good, thorough background checks, and then we get those individuals within our organization and we train them extremely well. Training doesn't stop, all right?
Ever.
Should never
Never
stop.
stop.
Exactly.
But it does in a lot of departments.
Unfortunately, and that goes back to funding, right?
does.
So when you're hearing the rhetoric and the noise about defunding, stop it. You're going to have the exact opposite of what you think you're trying to achieve. And that's when my personal opinion is we have to get to the table here. We have to have these conversations about what do you mean by defunding? Because you need the exact opposite. You need more funding for more training, for more consistent training. And I'll go back to my prior statement is the individuals that we hire, we want to hire someone that is high caliber character. First and foremost, we'll teach them how to be a police officer. We'll teach them, but it's hard to teach somebody to have character.
Yeah.
You either have that or you don't. So the first requirement is content of character. Well, you only get that by recruiting the best and then doing a thorough background check so that individuals that you hire possess those qualities. And if you do those things, then you can actually hire a police officer that cares, that wants to do a good job, and that will be engaging in the community. And right now, it's unfortunate and sad, but it's very difficult. It's more difficult now than it was 8 months ago, and it was tough then. So we need to get together, we need to heal, and we need to have some conversations so that we can get good people plugged back in here.
Well, I have a couple different personal backgrounds here. One, I was a mayor of this town for 10 years. And so I dealt with, obviously, our police department. We had a chief of police that was terrific and a sergeant who became the first woman sergeant, she's now the chief of police. He became the sheriff of our county. And two individuals of high character.
Right.
And that is where it started. But it also was very paramount from the beginning that they wanted, needed, and received the funding for training,
Yes.
both on and off site, because they had to get into other scenarios with other groups of people in order for them to be able to take things to the next level. So that's number one. Number two, I have two children who are in law enforcement. I have one daughter who is with the City of Wyoming Police Department, and I have a son who's a deputy in Newaygo County Sheriff's Department. Both got their bachelor's from Ferris State University in criminal justice, but we've seen changes, obviously, but we hear from both of them about both the training and what they're running into. But the one thing that we've learned with both of them, they're both high character people, both well respected, not just in their departments but in their communities. And when I say that, it is what you mentioned is exactly important. Is that my daughter is head of public safety or with Kalamazoo Public Schools. She is the liaison that is hired there from the City of Wyoming Police Department. So, but when she's not there, she's working in the same district with the same people.
Right.
So again, that respect level goes deep with the people within that community, and it is vital that that all our officers have a connection both with their community as well as with their other officers. And as a sheriff, it is kind of a political position versus where you've been, but your experience and what you've done will carry over a lot into making sure as a sheriff that you get the funding to provide maybe that you didn't have in there. And I think there needs to be some bridges here between political and on the ground, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But there has to also, it starts at home, the respect of all people starts at home.
Exactly.
And if you don't have that, then there's a breakdown that happens. And I think that's a challenge that you will have as a sheriff. It's a challenge you have in law enforcement. What do you see personally in the Kalamazoo area right now as to how they're dealing with all this, both as an officer and now that you're not in that position but running? How do you see that coming together in this next 6 months there?
Well, great. That is a fantastic question. Once again, and you're going to hear this, this is going to be kind of repetitive for me. It starts with relationship. We know historically it has come to fruition that law enforcement is going to do and has done, at least in my career, it's come through and emphasized a great deal on building those community relationships. However, it had to get there's still an element of a check the box mentality, right? So we had this training, check the box. We're going to go do this event, check the box. Sometimes that approach seems more structured and less meaningful. We need to go back to the foundation of building meaningful relationships, right? And it has to be done within the confines of non-traditional interaction with law enforcement. So it should be when, in this case, position I'm running for, a deputy's out on patrol. When he has time or she has time, you're stopping in and getting to know your business owners, right? But you're also stopping by if somebody's out mowing their lawn. Hey, how you doing? What's going on? Introduce yourself. Start to build those relationships one contact at a time. And throughout your entire shift, you may be able to reach out and touch, depending upon calls that day or other responsibilities that you have, you could touch, 5, 10, maybe more people throughout the course of that shift. And it's just showing that you care, right? That you're developing relationships. Well, what does that do? How does that trickle down? That trickles down to individuals that normally would not, maybe, call the police when they see something. They might reach out to that officer specifically and go, hey, I saw there was a car parked behind this business, or whatever it may be. You're getting information which is going to allow you to be more efficient and effective in bringing people that are doing crimes in your community, taking them out of the community. So the goal is to provide the safest and securest communities so that we don't have issues related to crime, right? Now, how do we diminish that? I'm a proponent of diminishing it through the relationship. You have to have the dialogue, and we have to be transparent in that. As far as Kalamazoo goes right now, everything is so heated nationally and within Kalamazoo, and that's okay. And I understand where we are nationally. There's righteous anger there. But how are we now going to come together, and how are we going to now be able to have dialogue and say, okay, how do we move forward? We need to heal. We need to heal within communities. We need to heal within this country, and it's going to take leaders to come forward, to step up to the plate, and to lead, and to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations, and then to be able to position ourselves and work together with our community to move the community forward in partnership. It's all about a partnership. Law enforcement derives our authority from the people that we serve. And I think we have to remember that. And I think we have to understand that it is a partnership, and we're there to serve, and we're there to protect, but we want their help. And we want them to know that we're there to help our citizens.
I just feel like, just like we talk about recovering in Michigan from what we're dealing with, all the businesses shut down, and we deal with schools, and it's in every area. And now we're dealing with this whole rioting and all this that's going on, and it is heated everywhere. But I think that recovery does have to start one community at a time, right. Meaning that may be the case, but it's not the case here.
Right.
Meaning everybody has to not look at, we're going to do this because of what happened in Minneapolis or Atlanta, but our community, our community members in our police department, our leaders aren't like that.
Right.
So we want to make sure that they know our voices are heard, but at the same time, we want to make sure that communication dialogue is open, because it is important, as I know, being a father of 2 police officers, it is scarier than it once was. It was scary enough.
Yeah.
Now it's scary because you realize that it's nobody's fault, but it exists. The tensions and so on. It didn't change their character, though.
Right.
And it doesn't change what they are as people when they go home or how they care about the people they serve, because I believe that 95% or more of every officer cares deeply about their job.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, that one community at a time in recovery is much more important than saying on a national basis we've got to solve a problem. It'll never get done from the top down. It's got to start from the bottom.
Oh, that very true, very true. And everything starts locally, right? Regardless of if people want to look at it through a national lens, everything starts locally. You know, my son is a county deputy, and it's interesting sometimes with the conversations that we have. But I always go back and you know, he's a good kid. My daughter's a junior in college. She wants to go into she wants to work with youth in something in social services, and I applaud her for that. But because you know, my son is now almost 3 years into his career, has started his third year into his career, and his eyes, you know, have been opened. The more time you have under your belt, the more discussions that we have, and I always caution him. I say, you know, there's good people everywhere, and you have to guard your heart within law enforcement because you're going to see some things. My time when in professional standards is internal affairs, so I handled a lot of internal investigations, citizen complaints against officers, right? And you boil it down to basically three types of issues that you see. You see the officer that has made a mistake, right? It was a straight up mistake,
and they are human,
and
so
they're human,
they make those,
right? And going back to what I mentioned about that article is that we have to understand that these are human beings. These human beings have issues and problems just like everybody else. And when you go to work, sometimes you have a bad day. You might snap at a coworker, right? That same thing happens. Is it excusable? No, it's not excusable, especially because of the authority that the community entrusts into a law enforcement officer. But it's explainable. And there's a difference between an officer that's going to make a mistake, right? And then there's an officer that has a bad day. So a straight up mistake we can deal with. Someone that has a bad day we can also deal with. How do we deal with that? Well, there's retraining, there's help, there's accountability processes in place. And then third, and the most concerning, is that officer for whatever reason that has acted in a way with malice and intent. Okay, that's a game changer. That third component here is an absolute game changer and has to be dealt with accordingly. Those officers that would behave in that manner need to be weeded out, held accountable and weeded out, because they are diminishing the hard work of the women and men that are doing a very tough job and care about a
And there
community.
usually are signs, either in training or in there, that need to be brought up sooner.
Exactly.
Not when it boils over and it's the fourth or fifth or sixth time that it happens. No different than it is with any job that we have. We have
Exactly.
people who are always doing certain things, and you kind of, brush it over until it boils over. In this case, it boils over into a much, much bigger situation. But I
Exactly.
think you can go back to two things: the character,
Yep.
and you can go back to the training. Because if you look at military, no matter how you feel, they have a certain protocol that they're supposed to follow. But we all know, as even with our kids, a lot of times that call, that backup, those things they're supposed to do, they sometimes fail to do through mistakes, through other things. And it's the same thing with making a mistake here. It could be pressure, it could be how they deal with situations, but typically it'll go back to, what is my training, what is my protocol, right? And
Exactly. And here's what you find, and there's a philosophy within law enforcement. I did quite a bit of training of certain things. I was a use of force instructor for 20 years. So I have actually taught firearms. I've taught control force. The philosophy is this. Basically, you have high frequency, which means a lot of repetition, right? And low frequency. So you have high frequency and low frequency situations. High frequency situations, you're going to train an officer on the gambit, so totality of the training on everything. But you want to spend your time, money, and resources on low frequency, high risk events. Right? So, and we want to focus on those events that a lot of that focus revolves around a use of force component, right? So high frequency events, you're going to get training on it. But if an officer's doing these high frequency events basically on a daily basis, so I don't want to spend too much of my resources on a high frequency training, because we're going to train to it, but you're exposed to it so much that it becomes, it's natural to you. So those low frequency but high issue events, that's where we want to spend our time, right? So your use of force events, your decision making, all those things. That type of training should be, in my opinion, should be scenario based. So you get with role players, whether it's a use of force, de-escalation, all these things that we need to be doing in a scenario based training, because you're acting out scenarios. You're acting it out with people and you're making decisions based upon best practices that your organization should have incorporated within your policy, so that you, when those situations occur, you've done it. You've had the repetitions, right? So if you start diminishing or defunding police, that's expensive. That requires a tremendous amount of resources. So whatever the intent was behind the defunding, you're having the exact opposite effect.
It'd be worse, 10 times worse.
It'd be a lot worse, right? Policing is a profession. Tell me or show me another profession where we're going to defund, and the first thing to go in law enforcement, or probably anywhere, is training, right? When you talk about budget issues, the first thing to go is training. Why? Well, that takes up a significant chunk of change. So if I'm going to start training, then you got to look at where's my staffing levels. Am I going to have to pay overtime to cover these shifts when I bring these other officers in? All these things are considerations. So you got to answer calls for service. 911 calls don't stop. Police calls don't stop because you want to take a day and get your entire department trained, right? So these are actual considerations that leaders within law enforcement agencies are confronted with. So you try to carve out that time, and you try to budget for that training, and you try to orchestrate it so it's a minimal impact as you can within a budget, but get the best training. We need to have a discussion about that. There's not another profession that I know of. Well, I don't think you'd have if you wanted to go see a doctor, or
there's always continuing ed.
Exactly. It's the same thing with law enforcement. We need to view law enforcement as a profession, and then allocate the resources in accordance with that.
With your experience in internal affairs, you had your 3 types of problems that you dealt with. 1 and 2, you said it was a mistake. Number 2 was a bad day. Number 3 was the bad ones, right?
Right.
And what % were the bad ones in your experience? What would you say?
That'd be to come up with a %. It's tough. But I'll say this: it goes back to what we talked about: recruiting, right, and background investigations. So the character of the individuals. The reason why those 2 are just critically important is because you're trying to weed out people of questionable character. Right? Now, sometimes you can do everything, and it's obvious because people slip through the cracks, and you have a bad apple in there, a bad actor. Well, that's going to happen regardless. That compounds it because of the authority and the power invested by the community into a law enforcement officer. So when you see these reactions by the community feels betrayed by the very person that they have given this authority to serve and protect them. That's why we see what we're seeing. There's a component of that, and I think we need to recognize that, right? You don't get into this job, and I had many conversations with my son as he's going through the academy, and we talked about the authority. We talked about the power and the trust that you are being given when you become a police officer, and how you have to conduct yourself with honor. You have to be empathetic. We have to be inclusive in how we build relationships and bridge gaps so that people have an understanding that we're there to help and assist and to protect. That in and of itself is the most important component. So a percentage. It's low. I don't have an exact percentage. It happens, yes, but everything that you do on the front end, the recruiting, the background investigation, all that training, all that goes into, and don't forget, during that process, these individual officers are on probation. And there's some officers that don't make probation.
Well, there's probably more that shouldn't,
Right.
because of the lack of the pool that
Exactly.
you've had,
Yeah.
the recruiting issues.
Right.
And some of that has to do with the pay that they get. It's almost like they say, is it worth it? But I do know that also certain districts and areas have probations that are a year long.
Right.
They're a long situation, and it's a long time till they do things on their own. And there are others that it's a kind of trial by fire. And
Right.
unfortunately, they're kind of left there pretty quickly, and some of them then spend 10 or 15 years and never really went through what they should have.
Yeah.
Most of that's due to lack of funding also, though.
And you're starting to hear from a national standards argument, right? As it comes into the conversation as regards to law enforcement, and I think that's a legitimate conversation to have. We have to be mindful, though, that budgets vary depending upon your geographic location,
Yes.
and that's huge. So if we're going to have that, and I'm not opposed to national standards at all. I think let's have that conversation, and how do we construct it, and how do we best move forward with it. Larger organizations like the city of Kalamazoo, we spend a lot of time training people. Because number one, we're police, fire, and EMS, so you not only are you going to go through an advanced police academy, but you're going to go through a 16-week fire academy, plus you got 6 weeks of medical. You're a solid year and change before you'll ever hit the road. And then once you hit the road, you're hitting the road with a FTO, so field training officer. And then you've got to successfully complete that FTO process, right? So, but that's not everybody has those resources and that the ability to even do that. So we have to kind of understand that if we're going to go to a national standard, which I'm not opposed to at all, I think, gosh, but okay, how now are some of our organizations that are that are cash strapped, resource limited? How can we make this happen for them as well? And that's a conversation that we have to have moving forward.
So we've talked a lot about police officers,
Right.
and what we have to do for police and engagement with the community and character and trust and so on. What I'd like you to talk to is also the parents.
Right.
Because in your 26 years, you've seen a lot of that.
Right.
Kids are only as good as the example that they have and the leaders, the people that they are that they're associated with from the time that they're young and so how do we start there? Because if that respect is done as an early age and a relationship or a trust, a respect, whatever, that changes things. So how do we deal with it from that end? Because it isn't just how do we change a few bad police officers and train people, but it is how does the rest of society interact with that?
Fantastic question. And part of that, as we're talking about here, you put it in layers. And but before we get to there, I'll preface it with this. Law enforcement is the most visible form of government, and I mean by its accountability, right? So a lot of our issues from society are thrust on top of the shoulders of law enforcement, right? Mental health issues, when back in I'd say the early to mid 1990s, at least in Kalamazoo, when we had a lot of our defunding of our state mental institutions, right? Well,
We have.
Exactly. Well, where did those individuals wind up? They
On the
wind
street?
In the street,
Yeah.
in our communities, right? And at that time, how much training was law enforcement being given to deal with a mental health
And
issues?
how surprised were they when they put them into a hospital knowing how much help they need, that 3 days or a week later they're back again?
Exactly.
Because there was no ability for them to go long-term anywhere.
Exactly. So what you saw is albeit people can argue slowly, you see law enforcement go, okay, well, we need to have critical incident training so that we can deal with people in episodes of mental health crisis or episodes induced by controlled substance crises, right? So those are training components where you see law enforcement going, okay, well, we need to move in this direction. Now, that takes time. You don't flip a switch on some of this stuff. So there's a lot of things that have been piled on law enforcement shoulders. That's okay. Okay, but that requires additional resources to develop skill set. We got to have that conversation. Once again, I'll go back to profession. This is a profession. This isn't a job. If there needs to be national standards, then we need to look at and treat this as a profession first and foremost. From a standpoint of law enforcement interacting with youth, I think youth initiatives are absolutely critical. The breakdown of the family within our society is a contributing factor to a lot of our issues. I can't sit here and say that can we throw that on the backs of law enforcement? I don't think it's fair. But here's what we can do. And here's what officers I know would give their time to do because they've done it and they do it within our community. We need, remember what I mentioned, non-traditional interaction, youth initiatives. So whether that's through a PALS program in sports, you're familiar with PALS, or football, or whatever it is, football, baseball, whatever it is, or not even sports related. Maybe it's from an educational standpoint, maybe it's camping, fill in the blank. But it's important that these individuals, these young kids that may or may not have either a mother or father, see officers in a light, non-traditionally, that they're interacting with them, they're seeing them invest, they're building those relationships, and they're seeing them outside of a police car whizzing by with lights and siren thinking, what just happened? So it's non-traditional interaction within our community, specifically with our children, that I think is going to make the biggest impact on how we move forward.
And, I think it's also unfair to put that on, yes, we need that interaction.
Right.
But we also then have just lumped that onto the officer on top of everything else, and all of his other training is that he also needs to volunteer, which I agree with and I understand. But it has to start with other people outside of law enforcement teaching those young kids also. Their volunteering is just as important as that officer. Meaning they all have to have somebody to look up to. They have to be taught that respect level from each other, because typically the officer's coming in when there's other problems. It's interaction, right? So how do we encourage the people within those communities? I think it leads from law enforcement and leads from the top in a community, but it does start with the parents. It starts at every neighborhood, and we know the neighborhood watch. You have all kinds of other things.
Right.
What has Kalamazoo done in regard to those kind of programs outside of just the law enforcement volunteering, but communities volunteering to be the solution?
Well, Kalamazoo's got a very active and involved community, and I want to bridge a gap here. I don't think that law enforcement, and especially in Kalamazoo, within Kalamazoo Public Safety has done a fantastic job with this. We could always do more and improve. However, partnerships are crucial with this. So faith-based organizations, nonprofits, and social services, right?
Okay.
We need to look at ways in which that we can grow and expand those partnerships to have that impact, to build and reach farther out into our communities and to engage more.
So the people are the solution,
Right.
not bigger government and more officers.
No.
It really involves all of those organizations working together.
Exactly.
the
And that's starting.
And we've been talking about we the
Right.
people.
Exactly.
It is.
And just to go off on that too, it's just like getting the silent majority to start to speak up. If you weren't speaking up against police officers, you were a racist last week.
Right.
And that's not right.
Right.
You can't allow the few in a profession to define the profession.
Right.
And I saw a meme the other day, somebody's been posting, say, hey, millions of people support the men and women that wear the badge. And I was like, no. Hundreds of millions of people support the men and women that wear the badge.
Right.
And so I think you're exactly right. We're having these conversations in the community and having other people involved in that community to stand up. And it all starts just with having those difficult conversations. And we need to have them. We need to start the healing process.
And we see the same thing, the challenges going on in the school systems.
Right.
You have the teachers who have no control anymore because they have, and so it's become a very tough profession where it used to be you just took them. Now that's the place they get a lot of their guidance, a lot of their leadership, a lot of the people there are usually were teachers, and now you see a lack of respect there too. But it is that whole combination of community, meaning we have to take the responsibility ourselves.
Exactly. And you see time and time again. I'm a big supporter of our teachers. We got friends that are teachers. I still talk to some of my coaches from back when I was in high school. As a matter of fact, my wrestling coach was my son's wrestling coach in high school. That's incredible. That's and to be able to trust that my coach, Ken Hahn is his name, and shout out Ken, but. There's a trust there. When you've played sports, Garrett, you understand the discipline, the work ethic, everything that goes into mental fortitude, mental toughness, the teamwork, the sacrifice that you're going to give for the team. Those are qualities. Those are such an important life lessons that they may not be getting at home. For whatever the reason is, and we've discussed a little bit about that. But they find it with the team, that student athlete, to be able to take that skill set that you're learning, and a lot of times they don't even know they're learning it until later. But it's so important, and those teachers that are investing in our young women and men, and it doesn't just have to be sports. That could go on over to other academic issues as well. But I feel bad for these teachers. They have a very difficult job. It is changed, and we need to recognize that and be very that's a whole other conversation.
It is.
It really is a whole other conversation. But.
Especially with them going back to school, we just talked to with the mom.
We did.
Just before.
All the changes that are expected, which isn't going to be easy for anybody, and I think that some of it has to be stood up and said that just isn't possible in order for us to interact with each other.
Right.
And they were defunded by the quarantine. Basically, the teachers in the school systems. I mean, their budget is non-existent.
It's going to be a bad, sad situation.
Yeah.
We just want to thank you so much for coming in and giving us a glimpse of law enforcement, both from the inside and from the outside now.
Thank you.
As a father and as a leader in your community, and I know that it's a good time for us to open that dialogue, but also to understand what it is we're facing together.
Yeah, no, I thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity just to kind of share my heart. And I think first as leaders, some tend to be a bit guarded, but I think our community has to get to know us, get to know where our heart is. And if I'm putting myself out there to lead, then I want to put myself out there for the community to get to know me and where my heart is. And it's a heart of service and how we want to move and work together collaboratively to heal and then to provide the very best possible service that we can provide to our community. And that's a conversation that never ends. And it's work that never ends. It's perpetual. So I want to thank you again.
So much for your service.
No, thank you. Appreciate
you for coming on.
Thank you. I really do. Thanks much.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Lantern Podcast, where we'll continue to be the lantern in the darkness of today's challenges. Until next week, folks.